When U.S. voters go to the polls in November, the vast majority of the races on the ballot will be between two candidates, a Republican and a Democrat. These two political parties have been the dominant force in American politics since the Civil War. However, a Gallup poll conducted in February 2021 showed that 62% of Americans believe that a third major party is needed to adequately represent the electorate. This isn't a new idea either. According to Gallup's past data on the same question, more than 50% of citizens have consistently wanted a third party since October of 2013. However, despite voters wanting more options, no party has been able to rise to the challenge and meet this demand. Minor parties such as the Green Party and the Libertarian Party have failed to gain any national significance, often being referred to as spoiler candidates. So, let's explore why the U.S. electoral system favors two candidate races, and what changes might be made in order to open up U.S. elections to other parties. Before we get started, I want to make two quick points. In another video, I put forward the idea that the U.S. actually has four parties, and that the Republicans and Democrats are more accurately described as coalitions. I'll leave a link to that video in the description, but since both groups are considered parties by both U.S. legal standards and public perception, I will be referring to them as parties for the duration of this video. Additionally, I'm only going to be discussing the structural elements that hinder minor parties in their pursuit of political power, rather than commenting on specific party platforms and how popular they may or may not be with voters. If you'd like to see a video on the minor political parties in the United States and their specific policy platforms, leave me a comment so I know you're interested. With those disclaimers out of the way, let's discuss how the structure of U.S. elections favors a two-candidate system. In the U.S., each member of Congress comes from a single-member district. A single-member district is simply a designated area represented by one elected official. That area may be an entire state for a senator, or a weirdly drawn district for a member of the House of Representatives. Regardless of the size or shape of the district, there can only be one winner at the end of the day. So, what does it take to win? In 48 of the 50 states, you simply need to get more votes than any other candidate, otherwise known as a plurality. If there are only two candidates, one would need over 50% of the vote to win. However, as more candidates enter the race, the minimum number of votes needed decreases dramatically. In a three-way race, the winner might only need to exceed 33% of the vote. With four candidates, the winner only needs to clear 25%. In reality, votes rarely spread out quite that neatly, and smaller parties in the U.S. generally receive less than 5% of the vote. In the 2020 election cycle, only 12 congressional candidates won their election by less than 50% of the vote. However, that doesn't mean that third-party candidates still can't have an impact on the outcome. Elections are, after all, a zero-sum game, so every vote gained by one candidate is a vote lost by another candidate. Let's imagine we have a competitive House race with three candidates, one Republican, one Democrat, and one left-of-center independent. The Republican gets all of the Republican votes since there are no other similar candidates to compete for those votes. We will assume that they also get some right-leaning independent votes, giving them 47% of the total votes cast. On the other hand, the Democrat and the Independent are on the same side of the political spectrum, so they will end up competing with each other for both Democrat and left-leaning independent voters. The Democrat ends up with 45% of the vote, with the Independent getting the remaining 8%. After all the votes are tallied, the district would be represented by a Republican, even though the majority of the voters would prefer a more left-leaning candidate. This scenario is an example of vote splitting, where the distribution of votes among two or more similar candidates reduces the chance of winning for any of the similar candidates, thereby increasing the chance of winning for a dissimilar candidate. At its core, this means that the less competition there is for votes, the more likely it is that the results of an election will accurately reflect the will of the majority. Due to the effects of vote splitting, third-party candidates are often referred to as spoilers. This title comes from the fact that while they don't have enough support to outright win the election, they do have the ability to cost a more popular candidate the victory by siphoning off critical votes. So, unfortunately for those who would like to see a prominent third party, the current structure of U.S. elections means that the more candidates there are, the less likely it is that the results of an election will accurately reflect the will of the majority. However, the stigma of being a spoiler is not the only issue faced by minor parties in the US. The other major issue that third-party candidates face is their lack of established political infrastructure. As I stated at the start of this video, the Democratic and Republican parties have been the dominant force in American politics since the Civil War. In contrast, the two largest third parties in the US didn't formally enter politics until well over a century later. The Libertarian Party was founded in 1971, and the National Green Party was only founded in 2001. As newcomers to the political arena, they don't have nearly the same network of dedicated voters, fundraisers, grassroots organizers, volunteers, and consultants as the two major political parties. This lack of key resources makes it incredibly difficult for minor parties to even participate in the political process. As an example, this lack of resources often prevents candidates from minor parties from even getting their name on the ballot. Laws concerning ballot access vary widely from state to state, with many different requirements regarding things such as filing fees or petition signatures. Additionally, there are often different standards within each state for candidates from, quote, ballot qualified parties, as opposed to candidates from minor parties and independent candidates. For example, to run for the U.S. Senate in Texas, a candidate from a ballot qualified party is only required to file 5,000 signatures. Any other candidate is required to file 83,434 signatures. So, how do you become a ballot qualified party? Again, requirements vary from state to state. Parties might be required to get a certain percentage of the vote in the last election, submit a petition signed by a number of supporters, put forward one or more candidates, or register a certain number of voters affiliated with the party. Obviously, the Republican and Democratic parties are recognized as ballot qualified in all 50 states. Meanwhile, the Libertarian Party is only qualified in 33 states, and the Green Party is only qualified in 17. It is often a major struggle for candidates to simply maintain their status as a ballot-qualified party. For example, the Libertarian Party lost its status as a qualified party in Maine after they didn't receive enough votes in the 2018 election. Given all these hurdles, it's no wonder that the vast majority of elections in the United States do not feature a third-party candidate. If one of these candidates can make it onto the ballot, they still have to actually try and win the election. This comes with a whole new set of problems. The biggest problem is a lack of resources. U.S. elections are incredibly expensive, with candidates paying for things like advertising, rallies, polling data, and consultants in order to figure out how to most effectively get their message to the voters and help them get an edge over the competition. Additionally, campaigns will employ a small army of volunteers to help with tasks like canvassing and coordinating small-scale campaign activities. The Republicans and Democrats each boast tens of millions of registered party members and billions of dollars in campaign funds, allowing them to easily get their message to the voters. Meanwhile, the Libertarian Party only has 693,634 members, and the Green Party only has 245,626 registered members. Their resources are further limited by the stigma of being a spoiler that we discussed earlier. Very few voters are going to want to donate their hard-earned money or volunteer their time for a candidate that they don't actually think can win an election. Similarly, large dollar donors are going to avoid these minor party candidates that they think won't win, and instead give their funds to major party candidates that they think will help enact their desired policies. You can see how this quickly becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. People don't believe third-party candidates can win, so they don't support them. Since voters don't support third-party candidates, those candidates don't win elections, thereby fulfilling the expectations that voters initially had for them. This cycle repeats every time there's an election, condemning these smaller parties to remain on the fringes of U.S. politics. So, now that we've discussed the reasons that U.S. elections favor a two-candidate system, let's discuss some changes we could enact in order to make our political system more accessible to minor parties. The quickest way to get smaller parties into the political system would be to use proportional representation by state to allocate seats in the House of Representatives, rather than single-member districts. Under proportional representation, voters in each state vote for the party they want to represent them rather than an individual candidate. In many countries that already use proportional representation, parties will make a list of candidates available so voters still have an idea of the people who will end up representing them. After the election, seats are awarded based on the percentage of votes that a party receives, so long as they clear a vote threshold, typically 3 to 5%. If the votes do not divide evenly into the number of seats available, the state has the right to determine how best to round votes in order to achieve a fair result. To keep the math simple, let's say a state has 10 seats in the House of Representatives with a vote threshold of 5%. After all the votes are tallied, the Republicans have 50% of the vote, the Democrats have 38%, the Libertarians have 10%, and the Green Party has 2%. The Green Party failed to meet the vote threshold, so they are not allotted any seats. The rest of the parties get to nominate a number of representatives equal to the percentage of the votes they received. Therefore, the Republicans would get 5 seats, the Democrats would get 4 after rounding, and the Libertarians would get 1. Even though third-party candidates still probably won't get too many votes to start with, it is admittedly much easier to clear a 5% minimum vote threshold than it is to win a plurality in a traditional district. The other added benefit of proportional representation is that gerrymandering will be a thing of the past, as there are no districts to draw. However, proportional representation does have its own shortcomings. Firstly, this system cannot be effectively applied to the Senate, as it is not possible to divide 2 seats among 3 or more parties if they all exceed the vote threshold. Additionally, this system would limit the impact of various minority groups within states. For instance, large population centers like cities would have more influence than rural areas, since representation would be solely based on the statewide vote. Given the increasing urban-rural divide in the U.S., this system could cause rural voters to feel even further disenfranchised. This system could also dilute the influence of racial minorities, especially those currently represented by majority-minority districts. Another solution that might help make U.S. elections more representative is a runoff system. Under this type of electoral system, a candidate must receive a majority of the votes to win. If no candidate receives a majority, then the 2 candidates with the most votes advance to a second election, while the rest are eliminated. Georgia and Louisiana already have this kind of a system in place. Under this system, there is no chance for a third-party candidate to be a spoiler, as a majority is always required to win. Since the risk of vote splitting has been removed, voters might be more comfortable choosing a third-party or independent candidate in the first round of elections. Even if their preferred candidate doesn't advance to the runoff, voters at least have a second chance to pick a candidate that best represents their views. As people get more comfortable with voting for minor parties, they can slowly grow their base of support until they can actually compete with the 2 major parties. However, runoff elections are not without their own set of issues. Given the lack of broad support for third parties at the moment, it is more likely than not that any runoff will be between a Republican and a Democrat, or even worse, between 2 members of the same party. The initial elections in both Georgia and Louisiana are known as open primaries, where all candidates are on the same ballot regardless of party affiliation. Even the major parties do not have individual primaries, so there can be multiple Democrats and Republicans running alongside any third-party candidates. In these circumstances, vote splitting becomes extremely severe, sometimes leaving 2 candidates from the same party with the top 2 vote totals. In this case, the threat of third-party candidates being a spoiler actually increases, therefore decreasing the likelihood that voters will support them. Lastly, this system is just more expensive for the states, as it requires them to run an additional election. The final option that might help third parties gain more support is the use of ranked choice voting. In this system, voters rank all candidates on the ballot in order of preference, rather than voting for a single candidate. If a candidate receives more than 50% of the first preference votes, then they win the election. If no candidate has a majority, then the candidate with the least first preference votes is eliminated, and each of their votes is reassigned to the second preference candidate as indicated on the ballot. If there is still no winner, This process is repeated until one candidate has a majority. By transferring the votes cast for the eliminated candidate to the voter's next choice rather than discarding them, ranked choice voting completely eliminates the threat of vote splitting. Even if a race decided to run an open primary style race with many different candidates, the vote would still accurately reflect the will of the voters, as the voters have expressed their preference on all of the candidates rather than being forced to choose just one. Additionally, there's no need for the state to rerun the election, making it a more efficient option for the states to implement. In fact, 2 states, Maine and Alaska, have already adopted ranked choice voting for federal elections, with 13 other states using the system in certain jurisdictions within the states. Despite its many benefits, ranked choice voting does come with its own issues. While this system certainly makes it easier for voters to support third-party candidates without the risks of vote splitting, these candidates still need to get enough first preference votes in order to not be eliminated at the start of the process. Given the fact that voters know very little about the minor parties and the resource disparity that these candidates face, it's more likely that they're going to end up as a second or third preference choice rather than most people's first choice. There is also some potential for the perception of unfairness when using ranked choice voting. The candidate who receives the largest number of first preference votes may go on to lose to the second or even third place candidate as votes are redistributed. Given the impact that unproven claims of voter fraud made by former President Trump and his allies have already had on voters' confidence in election results, a more complicated voting process such as ranked choice voting may lead to further attacks on the electoral system if voters believe an election has been stolen from their preferred candidate. While these attacks are meritless, given that voters get to choose their second and third preferences as well, there is still a risk that losing candidates may try and misrepresent the results in an attempt to overturn the election. So, which of these systems would best help create more representative elections? If the goal is to get third parties a seat at the table as quickly as possible, the best option is to switch to proportional representation for the House of Representatives. Since it only requires a small amount of the total vote to win seats, third parties would have a much better chance to get at least one candidate into office. However, this system would be a massive change from the current setup of U.S. elections. We discussed earlier how this system might skew representation towards urban centers and away from minority groups, but there is also a more cynical barrier to its implementation. Proportional representation would replace individual districts with a statewide vote. The party that controls the state government therefore loses the ability to gerrymander districts to increase their odds of securing power at both the state and national level. Given the vast amounts of political power that can be secured through gerrymandering, it is very unlikely that state governments are going to give up this power in order to implement proportional representation. Of the 2 remaining options, I believe that ranked choice voting is the most pragmatic solution. It allows voters to express their preference on all of the candidates at once, and it allows them to support a third-party candidate without the risk of throwing their vote away. As voters become more comfortable voting for third-party candidates, they will likely also become more interested in learning about their platforms and offering them support. This is not an instantaneous process, and it will require a lot of work on the part of minor parties to make sure that their message gets out there and that voters are aware of their positions and policies. However, over time they can build up a base of support and eventually stand in a place to challenge the 2 major parties. Given that 15 states have already implemented some degree of ranked choice voting, it's not too far-fetched to suggest that this method of voting might be acceptable to other voters across the nation. It might take a bit of time to overhaul our current electoral system, but I truly believe that ranked choice voting is the best path forward to ensure that all future elections truly represent the will of the people. Think about it. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more of my content, subscribe to the channel and make sure to hit the bell icon so that you get notified whenever I post new videos. If you want to support me on my other social media platforms, all the links you need will be in the video description below. If you have any questions about this video or another topic that you'd like me to discuss, leave me a comment and I'll do my best to get you an answer. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day.